Hey guys, this is my first video in my biology series of my high school tutoring channel. So this video is going to be an introduction to biology. And first of all, biology is the science of life. Biologists study life itself and the components of life. First, we're going to be talking about a biological hierarchy, basically the different levels in the biological world. Our first level is the biosphere, which is basically everywhere life exists. This is simply Earth because everywhere life exists is Earth. The next level is the ecosystem. It is defined as all organisms and their physical environment in an area. So for example, an ecosystem could be the Amazon rainforest. It includes all the animals and plants, which are the organisms, and their physical environment, which is the water, the rocks, the sunlight. The next level is the community. All the organisms in an area, so excluding the physical environment, just all the animals and plants and fungi, bacteria, everything. Notice as you go down this list, the areas are getting smaller and smaller, from macroscopic or larger to microscopic or smaller. Next is a population, which is all organisms of a specific species in an area. This could be just all the crocodiles in the Amazon rainforest. Next level organism is an individual living thing. Let's say there's a crocodile named Stuart who lives in the Amazon rainforest. He would be an organism. Next, it goes deeper into an organism. Sixth level is the organ. It's a body part that carries out a specific function. So a heart would be an organ. The next level is the tissue, a group of cells that work together. You don't know what cells are yet, or possibly you do, but it's basically a part of an organ. The next level, cell, is the basic unit of life. That's all we're going to be talking about cells for now, but we'll get into cells later in more detail. Next comes an organelle. An organ is a body part that carries out a specific function, but an organelle is, think of it like a tiny organ. It's a functional component of a cell that carries out a specific function. And the last level, molecule, it's a chemical structure made up of atoms. Atoms we'll talk about in our next video, but it's a substance, basically. All the way from the biosphere down to the molecule, this is the biological hierarchy. Next, we'll get into the themes of life. Since biology is the study of life, the themes of biology are the themes of life. The first one is new properties emerge at each level in the biological hierarchy, which we talked about earlier. These are called emergent properties. And this, written simply, is properties will emerge at each step that aren't present in the preceding step. For example, an organism can move and reproduce, but an organ, the preceding step, cannot. Here we're talking about the 10th step as the first step and the first step as the last step. That is not how it looked in the biological hierarchy I showed you, but you start from the smaller and get to the larger. Following this is reductionism. It's the science of reducing complex systems into simpler components. For example, an organ can be defined by the organs that make up it. However, reductionism is not always accurate, because if you take apart an organism, you'll still have all the organs, you won't have a living organism. The sum is greater than all its parts. Following this is systems biology. This attempts to model biology through interacting components, not just components, but interacting components. This helps us enhance reductionism. This is an actual part of biology, part of reductionism that works. Our next theme is organisms interact with other organisms and the environment. This should be pretty obvious. For example, a tree interacts with a bird that nests in it. a plant that grows around it, and the environment, the air, the water, the sunlight. This should be pretty obvious. The next one is life requires energy transfer and transformation. This seems pretty complicated, but most people would know what photosynthesis is. It's the way plants convert sunlight into chemical energy. And this is an example of an energy transfer and an energy transformation. Next one, structure and function are correlated. This one, for example, a bird has wings. Its limbs are wings, and a bird can fly. The wings help it fly. However, a whale, on the other hand, has fins that help it swim. The structure of its limb helps it perform the function. Next theme is the cell is the organism's basic unit of structure and function. So remember back when we introduced the biological hierarchy, we talked about the cell being the basic unit of life. And it's basically the lowest level that can perform activities required for life, including cellular respiration, which is breathing. And there are two different types. Eukaryotic cell has membrane-bound organelles. It's complex and specialized. It is different from a prokaryotic cell, which does not have complex organelles. It just has DNA floating around. Speaking of DNA, our next theme is heredity is based on DNA. DNA, which stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, is genetic material. It makes up genes, which are the units of inheritance. This ties back to our theme that heredity is based on DNA. Gene expression is the process of production through DNA. This seems complicated, so let's break it down. DNA is genetic material, but the DNA helps make proteins, which we'll talk about later. The process of production, therefore, is the process in which proteins are created. That is gene expression. Genome is the set of all organisms' genetic information, basically all the DNA and genes an organism has. Now, a DNA doesn't just create proteins. Its coding helps it do much more, including cell division, etc. Genomics is the studying the sets of genes. So it's a branch of biology that includes genes. Another branch of biology that includes genes is bioinformatics. It stores and analyzes data from biological materials. Moving on, we have feedback mechanisms regulate biological systems. So feedback mechanisms are things that sort of level out the system. For example, if your temperature is too high, feedback mechanisms lower it down. Negative feedback is when the end product slows down the process. It's better to think of an example, excess energy in the form of ATP. ATP is an energy molecule that we'll talk about soon. Now, negative feedback, the end product slows down the process. When you have too much ATP, it'll go back and it'll stop the process. And when there's not enough ATP, the process will restart. Positive feedback is the opposite. The end product speeds up the process. This may be confusing to think about. So an example would be blood clotting. Here, the blood that comes to your wound attracts more blood until the blood is finally clotted. It's basically a way to speed up and to regulate at the same time. It's very rare. Negative feedback is the most common. Our last theme is the evolution accounts for the unity and diversity of life. So evolution is basically the way that organisms change over time, species and organisms. And domains are, as shown here, they're the different branches, sort of life. So there's 3 domains: bacteria, which obviously contain bacteria. These are usually prokaryotic. There's archaea, which are also prokaryotic. And there's eukarya, which, as said by the name, are eukaryotic. This includes animals and plants and fungi. Eukarya has 3 kingdoms, which are subdomains, and plantae, like I said, plants, fungi, fungus. and animalia, animals. It also includes protists. So a eukaryotic cell may make up a single-celled organism. A small organism that just has one cell could be eukaryotic. And that's an example of protist. Protists can be in any of the three domains, but most are in eukarya. Next, we'll be talking about natural selection, which is a main theme in evolution. It says that organisms that are able to reproduce in a population have advantageous traits. In simpler words, it's survival of the fittest. If one bear has a better trait than another, it'll be more likely to reproduce. This was proposed by Charles Darwin, who was an evolution specialist. You may have heard of him. Last topic in evolution is the tree of life, and it shows the unity and diversity of life. An example is something like this. It starts with one organism, and it splits into different trees. So it splits into three different ones. This one then goes down. This one goes down. But this one splits into two more. This one just goes down. This one splits into two more. So this is a tree of life, and it shows how life is all connected back to one organism. And it's also showing how life is diverse right now. That's what this theme means. Evolution accounts for the unity and diversity of life. Next, we'll be talking about the characteristics of life. So all life have these characteristics. For example, the first one is that all life is made up of cells. Every organism has cells. Next one, every organism can reproduce. Third one, every organism has DNA. This sort of follows from made up of cells because all cells have DNA, whether prokaryotic or eukaryotic. All organisms can grow and develop. All organisms can perform the chemical reactions needed for energy. This is called metabolism. All organisms respond to external signals called stimuli. All organisms evolve. And all organisms perform the internal balance called homeostasis. So a little bit more about each one. Made up of cells, pretty obvious. Reproduction has offspring. Has DNA, pretty obvious. Grow and develop. It shows that throughout a life, an organism can grow. So for example, a caterpillar will then go into a pupae stage and then a butterfly. Metabolism, as I explained, it's a chemical reaction needed for energy. So I talked about cellular respiration a bit earlier. It's basically breathing, and it takes in oxygen, takes in a few more reactants, and then it produces energy and a few more products. Response to stimuli, for example, if I touch a cat, it'll most likely meow and run away. Evolution, as I talked about before, it's a theme of biology, and all organisms evolve. Homeostasis, this involves feedback mechanisms like positive and negative feedback. And lastly, we're going to talk about how biology is a science. So we're going to be talking about the scientific method, basically how to perform biologies, how biologists perform biology. So the first step is to observe and hypothesize. And an observation is basically something that uses the senses. For example, an observation could be the desk is brown. And then after that, you ask questions like, why is the desk brown? Hypothesis is a tentative inference, or basically an educated guess. So an example of an hypothesis would be, I think that the desk is brown because it's made out of wood. Now, a little backtrack, an inference is a logical guess, so which ties back to how a hypothesis is a tentative inference, an educated guess. This is different from a prediction, which is something that you think happens in the future. Like, I predict that this volcano is going to erupt. Inference is something that happened in the past or present. Now, to get to a hypothesis, you need reasoning. And There are two types. First is inductive reasoning, which is based on patterns, like trees are brown, wood is brown, everything made up of wood is brown. Therefore, if a desk is brown, then it's made up of wood. That's not that logical because there are other things that are brown as well. The other type is deductive reasoning, and it uses logic. So, for example, I can say that I saw people use wood to build this desk, therefore it's made up of wood. And this usually results in a hypothesis that's in if-then format. So an actual science example of this would be observation. I see that this chemical is green. Question obviously is, why is this chemical green? Hypothesis. If this chemical is green, then it means that blah, blah, blah. You fill in the blank, what you think, why do you think it's green? That's an example of the if-then format. The second step is to experiment. And an experiment basically tests your hypothesis. If it's true, you proceed onward. If it's false, you revise your hypothesis and you change it and then experiment again and so on. Now, data is observations you collect from experiments. And this is an important part of the scientific method. There are two types of data. Quantitative is measurements, like there is 200 milliliters of this substance. The second type is qualitative, and it's a description. Like I mentioned before, this chemical is green. In an experiment, there are variables, which is a changing factor. First, there's independent variables, which you manipulate purposefully. For example, I drop a bit of substance B into substance A in the experiment. Then dependent is the observed variable, what you think is the outcome. So the dependent variable would be the color of new substance A. Then there's control groups. It's not changed. And an example of a control group would be in an experiment where you have two plants, one receives more water than usual, one receives less water than usual. There would be a third plant which receives the normal amount of water. The last step in the scientific method is sharing your results. So a theory is a general tested explanation. A theory would be something like the theory of evolution, theory of natural selection, as we talked about earlier. Theory is a way to share your results. After you share your results, there's something called peer review, in which you share your results with another scientist who evaluates it. And it's extremely useful because you're sharing your ideas and you're getting feedback from other scientists. Then we have bias. It's personal opinion. So if I know scientist A and I peer review his report, if he's my friend, I'm obviously going to say that is good. If he's my enemy, then I'm obviously going to say that it's bad. And this must be avoided. It's important to avoid bias because it gets in the way of actual science. A model can be used in experiments, and this is basically a scale object. It makes it easier to study. There can be a model of something larger, like the sun. There can be a model of something smaller, like a molecule or something microscopic, a cell. And technology. This is further sharing results. It applies the science for a specific purpose, like bridge. A bridge is a mode of technology, and it applies physics, perhaps. Then there's actually sharing your results, how to write a paper. And there's three main parts of a paper, and it's claim, which summarizes the results. It's usually rewriting your hypothesis. Evidence, it's the analyzed data. It's also your arguments, like this is happening. The reasoning connects the evidence to the claim. So this would be like, because this is happening, my claim is right. And this is basically the scientific method. And this is all of biology. That's it for our introduction video. And you'll be seeing the second video very soon. Thank you.